In today's video, I'm going to show you how to use the brushes in the Amazing Watercolor Brush Pack for Procreate. Today's video is part 3. In the first 2 videos of the series, we talked about the basics of the brush set. We also talked about how to use the paper texture, and we went through the brushes in the set, the first half of the brushes. Today, we're going to talk about the second half of the set. If you're interested, please keep on watching. Hello and welcome to Color with Kendi, where we paint watercolor and gouache on the iPad in the app Procreate. As I mentioned, today's video is part 3. I would suggest watching parts 1 and 2 first before coming to this video. You can find the link to part 1 and 2 in the description as well as a pinned comment. Now, if you have the set already, please open up the brush tutorial canvas. If you don't have the set and you're curious to learn a bit more about it, you can find a link in the description as well as a pinned comment. So let's begin. Okay, so I have the brush tutorial canvas open. This is what we talked about in the previous video. And I was going to go to the layers panel now, and I'm going to turn off this group. And then we are going to talk about the shape maker today, all the way down to the splatter brushes. So let's just turn on the shape maker layer. Let's open the group and make sure that you're on this layer 27, 28, and 29. So we are going to discuss these brushes today. So last week we discussed the brushes in the set, the first half. So we discussed the sketch and erase brushes, the main watercolor brushes, the tapered watercolor brushes, the pigment shifters, the soft watercolor brushes, as well as the dry and toothy brushes. All of these brushes are meant to be used in a way where you're painting directly on the canvas. Today we're going to talk about a slightly different way of painting digitally with watercolor. We're going to talk about the shape maker method. So what I like you to do is tap on brush number 27. It is the first of the shape maker brushes. There are 3 of them. And as I mentioned in the previous video, whenever I have an A, B, that means the brushes are similar, slightly different textures and edges. So shape maker A, what I'd like you to do is pick any color of your choice. I'm just going to pick a black, well, not necessarily pure black, but just a very dark color, and use that. And I'll explain what I mean by the shape maker method. So I'm going to zoom in here, and I have a preset size of 7%. Now, before I test out this brush and talk about the nuances, let's talk about what the shape maker method is. So in the shape maker method, you can create a shape with the brush, and then you can convert that shape to white, and then add any watercolor effects you want on top. And this is a really great way to paint when you have a much more complex painting with a lot going on, and you will have a lot more control. One of the things I love about digital painting is the fact that you can paint with control. Now, traditional watercolor, you really don't have that much control. But in the digital space, you do. And with this method, you can always refine your shape after you're done painting. Let's say you go back and you feel like you need to make a change. You can definitely do that. So that is the advantage of the shape maker method. Now, if this is not very clear yet as we move through this video, it will become a lot clearer what you can use the shape maker method for. And I also have an illustration tutorial that you can watch where you can make a rose with the shape maker method. Okay, so now let's test out the brush. So with this brush, with light pressure, you create strokes that have a very thin line. And then as you use heavier pressure, you can create something that is a thicker line. So essentially this brush has a slightly jagged edge. It has an edge that kind of looks like watercolor. And what you can do is create any shape, especially looser shapes, with this brush. And it feels a lot more organic than using some of the other brushes. So if I tried to make these kind of strokes with one of the other brushes that we talked about last week, so for example, let's say the simple watercolor pigmented, it would not have the same effect because that brush was designed for something a little bit different. So when it comes to painting with very loose strokes, very expressive strokes, I do find the shape maker method works a lot better. So essentially what you do with this, let's go back to the shape maker. So what you can do is you can create whichever shapes you want with this. and you can continue to refine the shape as you'd like. And you don't have to worry about that overlap that we saw with the brushes last week. Once you're happy with your shape, what you want to do is convert it to white and then add watercolor effects on top. Now you might be thinking, why do you need to convert it to white? If you try to add watercolor effects on top of a color that is relatively dark, or even on top of a mid-value color, what's going to happen is you're going to lose some of that translucency and luminosity of the watercolor. So my suggestion is to always convert your shapes. Once you're happy with your shapes, convert them to white and then add watercolor effects on top. So I'm going to show you how to do it in this case, and then we'll move through the rest of the brushes here. So to convert this to white, all you need to do is go to the adjustments panel, tap on hue, saturation, and brightness, and then increase your brightness all the way to max. Now, what's happened is we have everything on the same layer, so let me just undo that for a second. So what's happened is all of our text here is also turned white. We don't want that. So in that case, what I'm going to do is just go to the selection tool, tap on freehand, and then I'm just going to go around this. Actually, I kind of missed a spot. Just go around this without missing a spot. And then go to the hue, saturation, and brightness, and then brightness to max. That way now our text retains its color and is not converted to white. So I'm going to tap on that. So basically now we've converted our shape to white, and now we can add whatever watercolor effects you want on top. And in order to do that, you need to use a clipping mask. So go into the layers panel, tap on plus, and then tap on the layer above, clipping mask. So now what's going to happen is anything I paint in this clipping mask layer will only show up on the shapes underneath. It's not going to go outside of the shape. It's going to look quite nice and clean. So let's pick a color that's kind of like a floral color, maybe pink. And then go into the brush library, and I'm going to talk about these brushes in more detail later, but let's just pick brush number 30, watercolor overlay. And now I'm just going to lay down that brush on the flower. I'm trying to avoid the stem because I don't want the stem to be red. So what I'm going to do here, I have a little bit of red right there. So I'm just going to erase it gently. There we go. And then for the stem, I want green. Then I'm going to go with the smaller size for the brush. And just lay down the pigment. So essentially what I've done is I've created a watercolor effect, a base layer on top of that shape. And now what you can do is you can keep adding more and more layers to add more and more effects. So let's add some more effects. Let's go to the layers panel, tap on plus, and again, make it a clipping mask. You might be wondering, why have I made this a separate layer? You can do everything in the same layer. I prefer to do things in different layers because that way, if for some reason I don't like a color anymore, I can just turn off the layer and change it up. It's a lot easier. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I want to add a little bit more pigment in the center. Maybe I want to add a yellow. So let's go to the color wheel and let's go to yellow, and let's go with a different brush. I will be talking about this brush in more detail, but we're just doing a quick test right now. So brush number 32, I'm going to go with the smaller size, size 15. And what I want to do is just dot it in the center. So do you see, I can continue to add more effects. I can change the color, change the size, and I can continue to add effects wherever I want. Now, maybe I want to add a little bit of darkness at the bottom of the leaves with a darker green. I can do that. So the advantage of the shape maker method is that you have the ability to create a shape, add your layers on top, and then if for some reason you want to change your shape down the line, you most certainly can. So let me show you what I mean by that. So let's say I'm happy with this. I could definitely add more effects with some of the other brushes. All of these brushes can add more interesting effects. But let's say I'm done adding effects and I want to change the shape. I've realized that I want the shape to be a little bit different. I have the flexibility to do that because I've used the shape maker method. So you can go to the layers panel, go to where you have the shape. Now you have your shape in white, so let's paint in white. So what you can do is just go into the color menu, double tap on white, and now I can change the shape. I can adjust the shape by going back to the shape maker brush and making slight adjustments. So let's say I just want there to be less of a gap here. I can do that. Or I can completely erase that flower and make another one. So you have so much flexibility with this shape maker method because now all I have to do is erase something and I can create a completely different look, different shape, but I'm not getting rid of the layers on top. They are still there. So now let's say I wanted the flower to have a slightly different shape, like this. I can do that. And I retain the colors that I had placed on top. So the advantage of the shape maker method is there's so much more flexibility with this method. And when you have a lot of moving parts in your illustration, I actually like to use this method more. You may not like this method, that's okay. I've added these brushes for people who find this to be an easier method. With digital painting, it's all about finding what works for you. If you don't like painting this way, then I would suggest that you paint with the other brushes, lay down the pigment directly, and then you can add on more fun effects. So I hope that makes sense. And it really is about trying different things and seeing what sticks. So now let's talk about Shape Maker B. So I'm going to go back to black and tap on brush number 28, Shape Maker B, and let's test out this brush here. So low pressure, medium pressure, heavy pressure. So you really can get thin and thick lines with this, depending on how much pressure you apply. And it also has a tapered end, which, as we talked about last week, to get that tapered end, all you have to do is start out with heavy pressure on the screen and then release the pressure as you move your pencil off the screen. So if I were to create a shape with this, I just want to show you. If I make a circle with this, so you see it has a slight jagged edge to it. So it's not completely smooth, because if it was completely smooth and then you added watercolor effects on top of it, it wouldn't look like watercolor. So that's what this brush is for. And much like this brush, you can also do looser shapes with it, but it is slightly different from that in terms of the edge. So now I'm going to show you side by side. So if I make a circle here with this brush, and then I make a circle with brush number 27, you'll see that they're very similar, but there is a slight difference. This is a bit more jagged, but the difference really is when you make lines like this. So now you can see this is more jagged, and here with brush number 27, you see some of that paint kind of becoming a bit more jagged than the rest of it. Like it's a little outside the bounds of the line. That's really the difference. So you can see here, 27 and 28, just by looking at these images, that is mainly the difference, but they are very similar. I personally prefer Shape Maker A for loose style paintings, but Shape Maker B is something that I'll use when I want more of that jagged edge. I don't want my painting to be too delicate. So that's the difference. Again, A and B brushes tend to be quite similar, but slightly different. And you can do exactly the same thing that we did here, is you can convert this to white and then add fun effects. So now let's talk about Shape Maker C, which is actually the tapered Shape Maker. I used to be called Shape Maker C in the previous set, but it is the tapered Shape Maker now. So as you can see in the image here, it has quite a bit of a taper. So this is excellent for botanicals. So let me show you this brush. So this is the preset size of 35, light pressure, heavy pressure. And as you can see with heavy pressure, you'll see this interesting textured edge that is a little bit different from the other two brushes. Now, if I use light and heavy pressure, that's what it would look like. So if I use heavier pressure in an area, you see much more of a jagged edge. And this brush is great for drawing things like stems and leaves. And as you apply more pressure, you will see that jagged edge. If I apply limited pressure, like this, very light pressure, and I create a circle, not much of a textured edge, but if I apply heavy pressure and create the same circle, I mean, it's bigger because I've applied heavier pressure, there's more of that jagged edge. So that's really how this brush is different. You really see the difference when you apply heavier pressure, and not just in terms of the size difference, but also in terms of the edge. And as with this other brush, you can do the same thing, convert it to white, and then add fun watercolor effects on top. So this is just a different way of painting where you have a little bit more control, and you can always adjust the shapes afterwards if you'd like to. So that is the shape maker brushes. Now let's move on to the next section. So let's go to the brush library and let's close this shape maker group and let's open up the watercolor overlay group. And open up the group and tap right here, 30, 31. So I don't know if you can see this. I already have shapes here. Let me just show you in the layers panel. So there are already shapes here that I made. I made these with the Shape Maker brush, Shape Maker A, and then I converted it to white using the hue saturation brightness. And now we are going to use the watercolor overlay brush. I made these shapes in advance just so that it's a little bit easier and you don't have to continue making shapes as we move through this video. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is tap on plus, make it a clipping mask, and now we're going to add the first layer, the base layer, the watercolor overlay. So pick any color of your choice. I am going to pick, let's say, maybe blue. I need to change things up. And I'm going to go to brush number 30, Watercolor Overlay A. There's an A and a B, very similar in terms of the concept, but slightly different texture. And this is the brush that I would use to create a base layer of watercolor for any of the shapes I've made with the Shape Maker brushes. And I'm going to zoom in and without lifting my pencil, just color it in. So that is the effect that you get. There is some luminosity, some areas that are dark, some areas that are not, and it's a great base layer. It's not so textured that it's going to impact your final painting too much. You still have control over what your final painting will look like, but it adds a subtle watercolor texture. Now let's go to Watercolor Overlay B. So go to the brush library. I'm going to tap on Watercolor Overlay B using the same color, and I'm going to increase the size to 100. Let's zoom in. And again, without lifting my pencil, I'm just applying the pigment. So as you can see here, it is a different texture, and it is quite textured in comparison to the other one. So if you like a lot of texture and that variation where there's a lot of lights and there's some mid values and some dark areas, this is a better brush for you. But I personally prefer this. I prefer it to be relatively delicate, not too textured, and then I add on the textures that I want. But it really is up to you. I wanted to give you two different choices, and depending on the illustration, you may pick one over the other. And once you've added the watercolor overlay, this is kind of like the base layer for your shape, then you can add on more fun effects with the overlay brushes. So I'm not going to do that here because we have another group where we're going to talk about the overlay brushes. But the concept basically is, once you have a base shape with the Shape Maker brushes, add on some watercolor effect, the base watercolor effect with either of these watercolor overlay brushes, and then add on more fun effects. So let's do the fun effects in another layer group. So let's go to the layers panel, turn this off, and then go to overlay part 1. Open it up and tap here. So I already have this ready for you, so we don't have to repeat steps. And now we're going to learn about all of these overlay brushes. So let's go to the layers panel and tap on brush number 32. This is a pigment bleed overlay, very fuzzy, soft, kind of like the pigment is slowly moving out and blending on the paper. So I'm going to zoom in, and because we have a shape that is pink, let's go in with a red. So with this size, if I tap, that's what it looks like. But if I go with a larger size, it looks like that. It flows out a lot more. So that's what the brush looks like on its own, but I'm going to use it with a clipping mask on top of these shapes. So what I'm going to do is go to the layers panel, tap on plus, make it a clipping mask. And now I'm going to use the pigment bleed overlay brush here. So I'm seeing that this color is quite similar to this one, so maybe I need to increase the intensity. So I'm gonna go down a little bit. And I'm thinking maybe I'll make it a little bit more orange so you can see it a bit better. When the colors are too similar, you won't be able to see it as much. So I've made it orange. Let's test it out. So I'm going to go in with the smaller size 15, and just tap. And you can increase the intensity of the color too. So that's what that looks like. And if I use, let's say, a larger size, this is size 70, I'm going to do this with a different color so you can really see, because I feel like this color is not different enough. So maybe let's just go back to that blue so you can really see the effect. So I'm just going to tap inside. If you want, it will cover the entire shape, but I generally don't do that. I tend to tap outside, especially when I'm using it at a larger size. And then it just goes around the edges. And you see, like, as I tap, I can build up more and more pigment. And what's happening is it's showing up here too. But basically this pigment bleed overlay, you can continue to add as many colors as you want. You can really go crazy. And you can add more intense colors, and you can create interesting effects with this. So I'm going to remove some of that because I thought it was a bit too much. So basically with this brush, you can add more and more pigment that kind of just bleeds. Hence it's called pigment bleed overlay. It's very soft and hazy. Now I'm going to show you with black, and I'm going to show you if I make it really small and make it targeted. If I make it really small and targeted, it's almost like you have little dots and then they are bleeding out. So depending on the size, you really do get a slightly different effect. So now before I move on to the next part, I'm going to erase this because I didn't need that. Okay, so now let's go on to number 33. Okay, so I'm going to go to the brush library and tap on Hard Edge Overlay A, brush number 33. This is by far my favorite brush because this is the one where you can really create interesting effects. And let me show you this brush without the clipping mask first, and then we'll use the clipping mask. So let's go back to our layers panel. Let's go to this layer where we have our shapes already. And let me just show you here on the side what this brush looks like if you were to use it without the clipping mask. So that's light pressure. I'm just moving the brush in a circle and I'm not lifting off the screen. Do you see it has a slightly darker edge, just slightly. Now, if I use heavy pressure, it's going to look very different. Do you see? Very different. You get this interesting effect and you get these jagged edges. But I generally will not use the brush like this. I just feel it's a little bit too much. I think the best effect comes when you vary the pressure. So let me show you again. If I use medium pressure and heavy pressure in some areas, light pressure in other areas, you get this interesting effect. Now, the other thing with this brush is, I'll show you right here. When you apply pigment and keep your pencil on the screen and lighten the pressure, it erases some of the pigment. So let me show you what I mean. Let's do this together. So heavy pressure, do you see how much pigment I have now? Make your pressure lighter. Ooh, it erases that pigment away, which is really cool. So this brush, it is very pressure sensitive and you will get different results depending on how much pressure you apply. And each time you use it, the shapes will look a little bit different. So this is by far my favorite brush. Okay, so now let's use it as a clipping mask, which is generally how I use it. So I'm going to go back to the layers panel and go to that clipping mask layer. And just because it's easier for you to see, let's do the clipping mask in a darker color. So maybe let's try dark red. Let's see, does it show up well? Yeah, okay. So I always test it out to see if it shows up well or not, but sometimes you need to adjust the colors. Colors can look a little bit different when you're using the watercolor brushes because watercolor is more translucent. So the color that you see here is not necessarily the color that you will see on your screen because watercolor is translucent. So just keep that in mind. So let's try this first and then we'll go to the flower. So with this brush, I like to go in always light pressure. And then if I want darker values, I just go in a bit dark. And now what I'm going to do is I'm keeping the pencil on the screen and I'm starting to lighten my pressure, erase some of that pigment. So do you see what's happening here? So sometimes in watercolor, when the pigment dries, you get this little hard edge of pigment and then it's a little softer. That's essentially what this brush can do. You can create that hard edge. Hence, it's called hard edge overlay brush. And I really love this effect in watercolor. But if you don't want to use it that way, you can just use it all over your shape and just vary the pressure. And you can create something like this. So you don't necessarily have a very clearly defined hard edge. It just adds a variation where you have some lighter values and some darker values. So that's really up to you how you use this brush, but I love to also layer on different colors sometimes too. So let's just go crazy and layer on some blue. And starting out light, I'm moving my pencil, I'm not lifting it off the screen, and then adding some more pigment. And then I'm going to erase away some of the pigment. So do you see, you can create really interesting effects with this. And this is by far my favorite brush to use, not only with shapes that I've used with the Shape Maker tool, but also shapes that I've made with some of the previous brushes that we discussed in part 2. So now let me show you how I would use it on the flower. So I would start out with light pressure, and in some areas a little bit heavier. And let's say I go on with heavier pressure on this side, and then I release the pressure a little bit. So now do you see, I went from a shape that was relatively bland, and then I added that interesting variation of values. And you can do this with multiple different colors as well. You can keep adding more and more pigment. It just adds more visual interest to your shape. So that is Hard Edge Overlay A. Now let's move on to Hard Edge Overlay B. Brush number 34. And I'm going to go back to the layers panel. I'm going to show you first without a clipping mask what this brush looks like, and then I'll show you with the clipping mask. So maybe larger size. So light pressure. So do you see here, there's not much texture inside the center and not much texture here inside the center. Here you'll see some interesting texture, kind of like, you know, when you add salt. That's why it's Hard Edge Overlay B. It's slightly different from A, slightly different texture, but similar concept. Now, if I use heavy pressure, you get more of that salt texture. So when we use heavy pressure here, we didn't get that. And then if I vary the pressure, you get that kind of effect. And what you can always do if you find some of these edges are a bit too harsh for you, let's say you wanted to use this as a background, you can go in with the smudger and just actually I'm on the wrong smudger, I think. Yep. Smudger A, brush number 6. Go in with that one and just gently tap, tap. You don't need to smudge like this, just tap, tap, and you will be able to soften some of those edges. So you can get interesting backgrounds with this. So now that you know what it looks like without a clipping mask, let's go back to the layers panel, go back to the clipping mask, and make sure we're still on brush number 34, and similar concept to what we did earlier. Start in with light pressure, heavy, and then release. So you see a slightly different texture compared to the other one. And if you use a darker color, you'll really see that. So you really see that salty effect. So yeah, these are actually the most important brushes, I feel, in this brush set because they really add a variety of visual interest. And every time you use the brush, it's going to be slightly different because they're so pressure sensitive. So turn on overlay part 2 and make sure that you've tapped on a layer 35, 36. And I've already made shapes with the shape maker and added color with the watercolor overlay brush. And now let's talk about the grainy pigment overlay A and grainy pigment overlay B. So the grainy pigment adds some visual interest that's not too in your face. So let me show you what it looks like. So I'm going to pick this color here, and what I'm going to do is go to a much darker value, going down at a diagonal. So I'm going to make it quite dark. And then go to brush number 35. I'm using the preset size of 25. And I'm just going to, oops, I'm actually on the wrong layer. I have to use this as a clipping mask, I forgot. So go back to the layers panel, tap on plus, make it a clipping mask. Okay, otherwise it goes everywhere. So do you see what's happening here? It's adding a certain graininess to it, and you can tap it, or you can just use it like this, and you can add more or less, and it just adds a little bit of interesting texture. And if it's too much for you, you're like, oh my God, too much, you can always go to the layers panel, tap on N, and reduce the opacity. And now it's a lot more subtle. If you zoom in, you'll see that it has some texture. And if I turn that layer off, do you see it's a little bit more plain? And now it's more apparent. So you can really customize this. I'm going to turn the opacity back on to max. And you can change the color here too. Right now we use quite a dark green. You could use a mid-value green. So this just adds a little bit of visual interest. And I like to use this a lot with botanicals. Okay, so now let's go on to brush number 36, grainy pigment overlay B. Similar concept, it also adds grainy pigment, but it also, if you can see here, it adds pockets of color. So let me show you this. I'm going in with the preset size of 25. And am I even on the right brush? No, I'm not. It didn't feel right. I was like, it looks exactly the same. I was on the wrong brush. So brush number 36, and this is the preset size, 25. And there are also different presets for the opacity, so you can also change that. Right now, we're on the lower opacity, so let's test this out. So do you see? It just adds some visual interest. But if you want it to be more intense, let's just go back and undo that with 2 fingers. And then let's go to the max opacity. And it looks like that. So again, you can really customize how it looks. Okay, so that is the grainy pigment overlay. Now, you might be wondering, when you are adding these overlay brushes, do you need to just add one of them? No, you can use multiple brushes. You can use these brushes as well as any of the other brushes in your clipping mask. I would suggest using separate clipping masks just in case you want to change something. And you can layer on effects with different brushes. That's really what I would recommend. So let me just show you an example of this. So let me clear this layer. Just click on clear. So now let's say I wanted to add multiple effects with different brushes. Let me show you. So for example, I can start out with pigment bleed overlay. I can add some pigment here, heavy pigment, the base. And if it's a bit too heavy, just go in with the smudger and just smudge it out just a notch. There we go. So I can start out with that. Then I can go in with hard edge overlay A, maybe go in with a slightly different value or maybe different hue. Let's test it out. Yep. I can go in with heavy pressure and then lighten my pressure. I can do that here too. And then I can go in with grainy pigment overlay B, maybe with something that's even more yellow. And then create something like that. So once you're happy with your painting, I suggest you do one more step for your shape maker method illustrations. And this is creating a slight dark edge to your painting. Because with the shape maker method, you're not going to get that dark edge directly. So if you recall, we had brushes that create a dark outline. But because we're using the shape maker, we don't have that dark outline. There is a way to do it. So let me just show you how to do that, because I think it really makes the painting pop. So let's go into the layers panel and let's merge these two layers. That's important. So basically, once you have completed your painting, this is kind of the final step, merge your layers. And then what I'd like you to do is go to your selection tool, go to automatic, make sure you're on add, and then just tap on your screen. And what happens is it will select everything outside of your painting. Now, if it's selecting everything on the screen, what you're going to have to do is put your pencil on the screen and change your selection threshold. You see, that's wrong. That should not be happening. It's too high, the selection threshold. I'm keeping my pencil on the screen and reducing the selection threshold. So let me undo and show you that again. So basically go to automatic, add, and tap. It should tap everything outside of your shape. You should still be able to see your painting. Once you're done that, now what you want to do is you want to increase how much is selected so that it starts to select a little bit of the edge of your painting. And the way to do that is to go to feather and go to about 3%. Do you see what's happening when I'm using feather? It's starting to select a little bit of your painting, depending on how much. Like if I go this way, it selected everything. But around 3 to 4% is typically what I like to do. So let's just go in with 4%, just so you can see. So what's happening is it's taking the selection that's outside of your painting and starting to select the edges, but it's feathering it, so it's not really harsh. Then what we're going to do is go to the adjustments panel and go to curves. This sounds really complicated, but this is all you have to do. Just tap on gamma. This is the method I use. It's been foolproof. All you have to do is right here, do you see this spot? Just tap on it. And then take this node that we just tapped on and bring it down. So what I want you to do while I do this is to look at that edge. It's going to start to become a little darker. You see? It's very subtle. You don't want to go too much. Now, if I go up and go here, do you see it becomes hazy? I don't want that either. So I have that node right here, and I'm just going to bring it down to about here. Just going down straight. Don't go down all the way. Do you see that's way too dark? That doesn't look natural. Let me zoom out. That kind of looks unnatural. It's adding too much of a dark edge. We don't want that. So bring it up. Right about here. And then I'm going to tap here. And you see it just makes the painting pop a little bit more. Okay, so now let's move on to the next segment. So let's go to the layers panel. Let's close this, close the group. Let's go to detail part 1, turn that on, open up the group, and tap on 37, 38, 39, 40. Okay, so these are your detail brushes, and there are several detail brushes here. These are mainly used for doing details, as well as filling in small shapes. Sometimes the other brushes don't work for really small shapes. I would use the detail brushes for that. So let's go into the layers panel. And let's go to basic detail A. This is by far my favorite one. And select any colors you'd like. Usually I do details in a slightly darker color. So I'm just going to show you that maybe in like a dark brown. So let's start out with the smaller preset size of 15. Maybe I zoomed in a bit too much. Okay, so light pressure. Heavy pressure, so it is pressure sensitive, definitely thicker lines. And for that taper, start out heavy and then release the pressure as you move off the screen, as we discussed with the previous brushes. And to get interesting effects, change your pressure. Actually, let me go in with a slightly darker color so you can really see. And depending on how much pressure you apply, each time you use it, it's going to be slightly different. No two strokes are going to be exactly the same. And it's really great for doing details where you want each stroke to look very organic. But sometimes with digital brushes, every time you use a stroke, it looks exactly the same. With this brush, you don't have that problem. Now I want to go up a notch, and I want to show you what happens when you change the opacity. So right now, I've used this at the higher opacity, which is 100. If I change the opacity to 35, the brush looks slightly different. So you see, that looks different from that. So depending on your illustration, you may want something that looks very clean, so use it at the higher opacity. If you want a little bit more of that mess, the edges are slightly bleeding, use it at the lower opacity. And this brush is also tilt sensitive. So it is pressure sensitive, as you can see. Low pressure, high pressure, but also tilt. So if I tilt my brush, let me just do that. If I tilt the brush, it's very faint. Do you see? No tilt, tilt. So it is also tilt sensitive. I really, really love this brush. This is one of my favorite detail brushes. So for very organic looks, go in with basic detail A. Okay, so now basic detail B. This is a bit cleaner. It's not as organic looking. And depending on your illustration, you may choose this one. So I wanted to give you options. Which one you choose will really depend on your illustration. So basic detail B, I'm going in with the preset size of 50. And light pressure, heavy pressure. It does not have as much of a taper. So as you can see here, we had a lot more taper. This one is not as tapered, but sometimes you need details that aren't so tapered. So starting out with low pressure and then increasing the pressure, I can get a variety of lines. Looks slightly different from this one. It has a little bit of a jagged edge. It's a little bit more translucent than this brush as well. And do you see here when we use this brush to make some marks? This brush, number 38, is quite different when you make marks. So do you see? This is useful for slightly different mark making. This is useful for slightly different mark making. So definitely this one is a little bit lighter as well. There's more translucency to it. So they're both detail brushes, but you will definitely prefer one over the other depending on your illustration. Okay, so let's go on to brush number 39, Wet Soft Detail. So I'm using the preset size 35 and the opacity of 100. So it has two opacities, we'll talk about that. So low pressure, heavy pressure, and then light to heavy. So it is a little bit softer and more blurry, the edges. You see this one? It's not blurry, this slightly jagged. So the edges of this one are a little bit softer. So if you need that in your illustration, you want some softness, I would use this for details. And when you create marks, it looks like that. So slightly different from these two. And if you use this at a lower opacity, it will look like this. Do you see it's even lighter? It's very, very faint. So really depending on your illustration, where you may want really faint, blurry lines, just very delicate, you may consider using this brush. Okay, now let's move on to brush number 40, which is the dry edge detail. And as you can see here, there is a dry edge. That's why it's called dry edge detail. So I'm going in with the preset size of 35 and at full opacity. Okay, light pressure. Do you see a lot of that dryness? Heavy pressure. You will see dryness at the edges, which is different from this brush. And this brush, there's no dryness. So if you want dryness, this is the brush to use. And when you do marks with this, the mark making looks like this. And when you dab it, it looks like that. Now, if you use this at the lower preset opacity, which is 75, it will look a bit different. Just a little bit lighter. Compared to this, you see, it's a little bit lighter. So that's really the difference. I tend to use it at full opacity, but you can definitely use it at the lighter opacity. And when you have the lighter opacity, what you can do is you can layer on effects and you have a little bit of that overlap. So that is dry edge detail. Let's move on to the next segment, which is the final one. We're talking about details part 2. So let's go to the layers panel, close that layer, turn it off, tap on this, open the layer, and turn on 41, 42, 43, and make sure that we have selected it. Actually, this is not the last segment. We still have the splatter brushes. So, okay, let's get to toothy detail A. All right, so let's go in and tap on brush 41. So this brush at low pressure looks like that. You see that toothiness of the paper. Then higher pressure, you see less of the toothiness. Now I'm going to show you at a slightly larger size, preset size 50, what it looks like. So light pressure, light pressure, heavy pressure. Light pressure, heavy pressure. And the beauty really is when you vary the pressure. So I can start out heavy and then go light. Do you see you get that little trail? So really vary the pressure with this one to get interesting effects. And also this brush is tilt sensitive. So if I use it like this without tilt, that's what it looks like. With tilt, do you see? It looks a little bit different. So remember that this one is tilt sensitive and you can create interesting marks with this one. And because it is toothier, you will need to apply a little bit more pressure. Because if you think about it, when you're painting with traditional watercolor and you have very limited pigment on your brush, you're gonna have to use it a little bit harder. So this is a little bit harder. It's not meant to be very easy to use. You have to apply a little bit more pressure to get the pigment onto the paper. Okay, brush number 42, Toothy Detail B. So similar concept to Toothy Detail A, slightly different texture. So this is the smaller preset size 15, light pressure, heavy pressure. Let's test this at size 70 so you can really see the difference between these brushes. Light pressure, heavy pressure. So now I think you can see the toothiness of this one is different from this one. This one is almost as if the pigment is being moved across the screen. This one, it's just toothy. You don't see the pigment being moved across the screen. And if I use it for mark making, that's what that looks like. And this one is not tilt sensitive. Doesn't really make a difference if I tilt it. Now let's talk about brush number 43, Ink Bleed Liner. So this is meant to be like an ink pen. It's not meant to be like a watercolor pen. I love to use this with watercolor though. If you really love ink pens, I have another set on my website too with a lot of ink pens, so you can check that one out. So anyway, let's check the Ink Bleed Liner. I like to use this with black typically, but not pure black. So I'm gonna go in with a really dark color that's close to black. Tap on brush 43. Light pressure, heavy pressure. Let's go in with a slightly larger size, preset size 30. Light pressure, heavy pressure. So you do see this one has a slightly jagged edge. So generally when you use ink pens, they won't necessarily have a jagged edge, but if you were to use ink pens on watercolor paper, because of the tooth of the paper, you will see a little bit of that jagged edge. So that's what this is supposed to mimic. This is a little bit much because we're using it at a very large size. Generally, I like to use it as size 10. Great for doing details. And it's just meant to be like an ink pen. And depending on how much pressure you apply, you can get thin and thick lines. So it really is nice for details, and it adds a little bit of visual interest because the edge is not completely smooth. Because I find with a lot of digital brushes, the edges are just too smooth. That doesn't happen in traditional media, so I wanted to create something that has a little bit more visual interest, which you see more when you zoom in, but even when you're zoomed out, you can tell that it's not perfectly smooth. So that is Ink Bleed Liner. Now let's move on to the splatter brushes. So I'm going to go to the layers panel and turn that off, close the group, then open up the splatter group, tap on 44, 45 and turn that layer on. So we have 2 splatter brushes here. If you like splatter brushes and you want more, I have more in my messy watercolor brush set as well. So let's talk about the pigmented splatter. So let's go in with more fun color than brown. Should we try green or maybe aqua? Okay. So there's 2. There's pigmented splatter and dilute splatter. For the pigmented splatter, as the name suggests, we're pigmented. So this is the preset size of 40. When I apply light pressure and move across the screen, that's what it looks like. And every time you use this brush, it's going to have slightly different effects. I can do the same thing again, slightly different effect. So that's kind of how it keeps it looking organic. And if I apply really heavy pressure, then we're going to get really big dots. So we don't want to do that. To get the best effects with this brush, what you want to do is vary the pressure as you apply the pigment onto the screen. So I'm going to show you that. So I'm going in with light pressure here, really light, so they're really tiny, and then increasing the pressure and then heavy pressure. So now you get that organic look. I could do this again. I'm going to get a different result. No 2 strokes will be exactly the same. So that's really the fun thing with this brush. Let's go on to brush number 45, which is dilute splatter. So this brush, I'm going to use at the lower preset size of 15. So that's what that looks like. I'm just going to move across the screen. So that's what that looks like. Now, if I use heavy pressure, the size becomes a little bit bigger. It doesn't change the intensity that much. Now, if I use it at a larger size, size 100, and move across the screen, that's what that looks like. So I generally kind of move across the screen. You can also tap and tap in different areas and layer it on. So really play around with this. They're both quite different and just have some fun. So that is it. We're at the end of the brush set. And this was definitely a long brush tutorial series, parts 1, 2, and 3. It kind of felt like a mini course, but I hope by the end of these 3 videos, you have gained so much insight into every brush. And now you know what each brush does, the nuances, and hopefully you can make really great artwork and you know how to select your brushes. If you have any questions, you can always send me an email. And if you haven't yet purchased the set and you are interested, check out the link in the pinned comment and the description. Anyway, I will see you in the next video. Bye!